73 European operatives, pale, silent, once untouchable, were sent 300 feet underground by President Ibrahim Traoré. Not to be shot, not to be exiled, but to mine gold under the same soil they once tried to steal, with hands that had once signed contracts, launched coups, pulled triggers, now blistered, now trembling. The shaft was hot, the air was thick. 12-hour shifts, no pay, no press, no applause. They came to control the gold, but they ended up digging for redemption. In a nation long scarred by racism, betrayal, and silence, one leader chose a punishment older than prison, to make them rebuild the land they broke. Is this justice or revenge dressed in restraint? Is this redemption or reckoning with a different name? What you're about to hear is a fictional account, but built from centuries of real pain, power, and forgotten history. The story is imagined. The emotions are not, because sometimes the truest stories are the ones we dare to tell, when the world refuses to listen. The night was thick with heat, that kind of West African heat that doesn't fall asleep when the sun does. Crickets sang in sharp, uneven rhythms. Somewhere in the hills outside Ouagadougou, the lights of a secluded villa blinked once, then cut to black. A single breath of silence. Then chaos. 3 trucks without plates came screaming up the dirt road. No headlights, no engine lights, just wheels pounding the clay, swallowing distance in seconds. A 4th vehicle, slimmer, armored, split off and flanked the compound's north wall. Inside, 6 men in linen shirts and calm voices sat around a glass table, sipping aged scotch over satellite prints. Their boots, still muddy from the border, sat neatly by the door. One man, tall with silver hair and a surgical scar behind his ear, leaned in to whisper, "Final go-ahead comes at dawn. By this time tomorrow, he's out." He never finished that sentence. A flash grenade hit the terrace like thunder ripped from the floor. Glass shattered, lights flared, and suddenly the night was full of rifles, boots, and voices yelling in a language the mercenaries didn't understand. Burkina Bay Special Forces flooded the villa like water through a cracked dam. Room by room, door by door, they cleared with precision that spoke of long preparation, not panic. In less than 4 minutes, the so-called contractors were face down, handcuffed, and stripped of their radios. One tried to reach for his shoe, not to run, but to detonate the transmitter hidden in the heel. A young soldier named Idrissa knocked him unconscious with one blow to the temple. It wasn't a rescue mission. It was an execution of truth. Not bullets, but exposure. Outside on the edge of the compound stood a tall figure in a plain field jacket. No body armor. No weapon in hand. His presence was quieter than the storm he had unleashed, but somehow heavier. President Ibrahim Traoré. Not flanked by generals, not surrounded by microphones. Just him, watching. He didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited. The commanding officer approached and gave a tight nod. All targets secured, no casualties, no alerts triggered. Traoré took one long look at the 6 men being dragged out, bruised, furious, stunned not by pain, but by the fact they'd been outmaneuvered. They weren't mercenaries in that moment. They were men whose game had finally ended, and they didn't know the rules had changed. He looked at them, one by one, his face unreadable. Not anger, not triumph, just something deeper, something resolute. He stepped forward, close enough for them to see his eyes. Someone tried to speak, to argue perhaps, but Traoré raised a hand, stopping him with the quiet power of someone who no longer asked for permission. Then calmly, almost like a whisper, he said the line that would later echo across a continent. "Let them go where they came to dig." That was it. No speech, no insult. Just a sentence heavy as stone. And in that moment, those 6 men knew. This wouldn't be a prison. This would be something else entirely. Voiceover begins, not loud but sharp like a needle into silence. For months, whispers had crawled through the capital. Whispers of white men in suits walking into ministries they didn't belong to. Of briefcases filled not with bribes, but maps. maps of veins beneath the earth, and blueprints of betrayal. The coup was never designed to be loud. It was meant to look like progress, like foreign assistance. But buried inside USB drives and encrypted calls was something else, a takeover signed in silence. Until someone, we still don't know who, leaked it. And so the plan that was supposed to unfold at dawn ended before midnight. The papers wouldn't report it, the embassies would deny it, and the operatives would disappear from headlines. But they didn't vanish. The next morning, as the sun crawled up Burkina Faso's gold belt, a convoy of unmarked trucks rolled toward a place not listed on any GPS. An old mine, long believed to be dry, long avoided because of its history. In the back of those trucks sat 6 men in shackles. Their suits were gone, their names erased, and ahead of them was darkness. Not the kind that comes from night, but the kind that comes from reckoning. The trucks stopped just before sunrise. There were no signs, no fences, no official entry, just an open wound in the earth, carved decades ago and left to rot beneath the red hills. An old mine. Some locals whispered it was cursed. Others simply called it forgotten. But today it had a new purpose. One by one, the prisoners were let out. Gone were the tailored suits, the tactical earpieces, the cold arrogance of operatives trained to disappear. Now they wore orange jumpsuits stained with dust before they even touched the ground. Their wrists bore steel cuffs. Their eyes flicked left and right. Not in fear, not yet, but in disbelief. A rusted cart on bent wheels creaked into view as one guard shoved the first man forward. Pavle stumbled, catching his balance. Eastern European, early 40s. Broad-shouldered, scar on his collarbone, ex-demolitions. He didn't speak, didn't resist, but his jaw clenched as he looked at the shaft. Deep, dark, breathing out heat like a furnace. Next came Victor, smaller, wiry, skin pale like paper. His glasses had been taken. His fingers twitched unconsciously. A strategist used to holding pens and planning from behind mirrored glass. His crime wasn't a bullet, but a briefing. And then Luca, the youngest. Italian, maybe late 20s. Tech mind. Quiet. Eyes darting like he was still scanning for signal. There was none. Just rock. Just heat. Just silence. The guards didn't bark orders. They didn't need to. Their eyes did the talking. Hard, silent, unwavering. One carried a file with names, pictures, and assigned zones. Another recorded every step on a hand-cranked camcorder. No streaming, no uploads. This wasn't for show. It was for the record. The men were led to the lip of the mine, a yawning black mouth ringed with warped metal rails and splintered beams. "Down," one guard said, pointing to the rusted ladder bolted into stone. Victor hesitated. Pavle went first. The descent wasn't long in distance, maybe 40 meters, but it felt infinite. The deeper they climbed, the hotter it got. The air thickened with dust and rust. Somewhere below, a generator coughed to life, and a single industrial bulb flickered in welcome. It wasn't light, it was warning. Their boots hit ground that hadn't felt breath in years. The walls were slick with condensation. The ceiling pressed close. Every sound echoed, and yet no one spoke. Around them, abandoned mining carts, broken shovels, crates stamped with faded logos from companies that no longer existed. This wasn't just a mine. It was a tomb for truths long buried. Pavle wiped sweat from his temple. This shaft wasn't sealed properly, he muttered, mostly to himself. The demolitionist in him was calculating pressure points already. Not to escape, but out of habit. Victor sat on a rock, coughing. Luca tried to pull his collar away from his neck. No one came to greet them. No overseer, no orders. Just a sign on the wall, hand-painted, nearly invisible beneath layers of dust. "You are not here to serve time. You are here to repay it." They stood in silence, the kind that didn't invite words, only endurance. Somewhere above, a bell rang, 3 short notes. The shift had begun. And just like that, the men who had come to destabilize a nation were handed pickaxes and pointed toward the wall. No speeches, no camera flashes, just the earth and their own breath, hot and short, in the dark. The mine swallowed them, and the surface forgot their names. The sun was already a white coin above the ridge when President Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the wooden platform overlooking the main shaft. A faint tremor rose from below, metal on rock, breath on dust, like a distant hive. Captain Jean Ouedraogo waited beside him, uniform plain, notebook tucked beneath one arm. His posture was straight, almost austere, yet the lines around his eyes spoke of nights spent awake, writing reports no one would ever read but history itself would remember. Traoré studied the pit for a long moment, orange figures moving in slow, synchronized misery, before speaking, voice low enough that the guards on the perimeter had to lean in to catch it. "Jean, don't make it cruel," he said, each word measured, heavy. "Make it clear." Jean nodded once, as if the instruction had been carved in stone years ago, and today was merely the unveiling. Below, the prisoners drove their pickaxes into a seam no wider than a child's wrist. The clang of iron on quartz rang off the walls, echoing back at them like judgment. Sweat drew crooked maps across their backs. Dust turned every exhale into a ghost. Pavle swung in steady rhythm, eyes fixed on the wall. Victor peered into the shattered rock as though strategy could still be drafted from its fractures. Luca counted strokes under his breath, a programmer hunting for a pattern the earth refused to reveal. No one spoke. No one wanted to waste the oxygen it cost. Marcel stood at the mouth of a side tunnel, rifle slung but safety off, boots planted as if the ground might shift without his permission. He let his gaze drift over the row of helmeted heads, yet when it passed Pavle, it lingered. Not in recognition of rank or reputation, but because the demolitionist's scar drew a pale diagonal over skin the color of chalk. A reminder of another night, another street, where Marcel's sister bled out before a clinic gate because rioters paid by these same foreign hands had turned the city into a chessboard. The memory pressed against his ribs like an unhealed break, but his face revealed nothing. He simply watched. An hour crawled by. Heat gathered, thick and punishing. The air tasted of metal filings and fatigue. Then Victor's knees buckled. His pickaxe clanged off a rail, and he folded to the floor, eyes rolling. Pavle paused, hand twitching toward him, habit perhaps of battlefield camaraderie, but stopped halfway. Luca froze, mouth open, unsure whether to shout for help or keep the count in his head. Above them, guards kept their distance. Marcel did not move. Captain Jean descended the ladder with deliberate calm. Dust settled on his shoulders like ash. He knelt beside Victor, checked the man's pulse, then rose and addressed the line without raising his voice. "Water break. 2 minutes." A guard tossed a dented canteen against the rock. It rattled to a stop near Pavle's boot. No one thanked anyone. Jean turned to Marcel, met his stare, and something unspoken passed between them. Pain mirrored, but held in place. When Jean climbed back to the platform, Traoré hadn't shifted an inch. "They'll last," Jean said. Traoré's reply was almost inaudible. "They must." The president let his gaze fall once more on the scene below, then started down the track toward the waiting jeep, leaving only the echo of boots on timber. Jean watched him go, then spoke just loudly enough for the nearest prisoners to catch the words, a verdict carved in calm granite. Let dignity rise through effort, not sympathy. The canteen passed from hand to hand in silence. Luca resumed his count. Pavle raised the pickaxe, and somewhere in the shadows Marcel's grip eased a fraction, though no one but the darkness saw it. The mind kept breathing, slow and relentless, as if testing how much weight a conscience could bear before it cracked, or was reforged. The bell rang at exactly 6 a.m., 3 short clipped notes that echoed through the shaft like a command etched into stone. There was no snooze, no warning chime. Just the sound, sharp, metallic, and inescapable, followed by the grinding of rusted gears as floodlights flickered to life overhead, casting fractured shadows across the cavern walls. Another day began in the depths. Luca blinked hard. His eyes, still heavy with unfinished sleep, adjusted slowly to the sickly yellow hue of the lights. He was already damp, sweat seeping from his skin before he moved a muscle. The mind didn't wait for your body to be ready. It forced you into motion before your mind caught up. 12-hour shifts. No exceptions. You worked or you paid. With food, with water, or with time carved from your sleep. He sat up slowly on the makeshift cot, more plank than bed, and looked at his hands. The skin had started to split beneath the calluses. Fingers that once danced across backlit keyboards were now rigid, trembling from strain. He flexed them carefully, wincing, then spat into his palms to soften the sting. His breath came shallow and the air tasted like copper. No one spoke during the morning rise. Words were saved for the hours that needed them, and this hour needed silence. Pavle had already risen, tying the laces of his boots with ritual precision. Victor sat against the wall, head down, conserving energy in the stillness. Somewhere a bucket clanged, boots scraped stone. Marcel's silhouette passed briefly beyond the bars, rifle slung low, unreadable as always. A few minutes later, Luca stood in his assigned corridor, pickaxe in hand, staring at the rock face like it had personally insulted him. The handle still felt foreign in his grip, like a lie his body hadn't yet accepted. He drew a breath, planted his feet, and swung. The impact jarred through his arms. The axe bounced uselessly off the surface with a thud. He gritted his teeth and swung again. The second hit sent a sharp bolt up his shoulder. The third forced a hiss from his lips. He paused, rested the pick on his knee, and glanced down. His hands were bleeding again, tiny red lines threading through dry skin and raw muscle. He looked around quickly, then wiped the blood on his pants, careful to keep his face blank. High above, a figure on the catwalk adjusted a camera. The mine had eyes. Guards recorded everything, not for cruelty, but for documentation. Each prisoner's pace, fatigue level, injury, and response time were logged. A line of scribes, not soldiers, sat behind small metal desks above the main corridor, tracking labor like data points. Their job wasn't to punish, it was to quantify. The message was simple: every stroke counted, and every failure was its own math. Luca knew he was behind. He wasn't built for this. He was built for rooms with air conditioning, for servers and passwords and dual monitors glowing deep into the night. He was fast, smart, valuable. At least that's what the agencies used to say. Now none of that mattered. Here he was a body, a variable, one entry in a system of restitution, and his body was breaking. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Pride wasn't the reason. It was fear, not of punishment, but of irrelevance. He had always defined himself by utility. If he failed here, if he collapsed like Victor had days ago, there would be no keyboard to hide behind. Only silence, only the low hum of earth pressing in, waiting to forget him. He tried again. This time the pickaxe struck with more force. A flake of stone chipped away. It wasn't much, but it was something. He exhaled, shaky but relieved. He shifted grip, found a rhythm, and kept going. Minutes blurred. Muscles screamed. But the motion became familiar, mechanical, meditative in its futility. Above him, one of the recorders leaned into a microphone and murmured, "Subject C. Luca, improved rhythm after third failed strike. Signs of adaptation, no medical flag." Click. Logged. Luca didn't hear it. He only heard the sound of his own breath, short and ragged, echoing off the walls. At 7 a.m., the bell rang again. Not to stop, just to remind them how long they had left. 11 more hours. He kept swinging. And behind the pain, behind the exhaustion, a different part of his mind, the old part, the calculating part, began to wonder, if they're tracking every hit, then what else are they watching? And why? The question sat heavy in his chest, right next to the pain. But he kept digging, because that's what the earth demanded. And maybe, just maybe, the answers were buried deeper. The dust clung to their shoes before they even stepped off the bus. 30 pairs of eyes squinted under the rising sun. Children, elders, a few mothers in faded dresses, some with babies wrapped tightly to their backs. They had come not to protest, nor to praise, but to witness. The observation deck had been built hastily with scrap lumber and corrugated tin, perched above the mine like a broken wing. It didn't promise comfort, only perspective. They filed into place without speaking much. Elders found shade beneath the only tree nearby, its leaves gray with dust. The children clustered near the railing, peering down through the gaps in the wooden floor at the world below. Some pointed, Some stared in silence. Below them, 6 men in orange worked under the gaze of both cameras and time. Pickaxes struck stone with dull rhythm. Sweat ran freely. No machines hummed, no radios played. There was only labor, hot and slow, under a sky that refused to care. Among the children stood a boy named Amadou, no more than 9, face thin but eyes alert. He gripped the railing with both hands, watching a pale man swing his tool again and again, missing the same groove each time. The man fell to one knee, and Amadou tilted his head. He turned to the woman beside him, a school teacher, young, composed, the type whose voice carried authority even in whisper. "Madame," he asked, "is this what justice looks like?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the men in the pit, watching the way their bodies moved, slow, heavy, untrained. She saw pain, yes, but also something else. Something earned, something slowly awakening. Finally, she spoke. "No, Amadou, it's what justice sounds like when it's being carved out." He didn't understand fully, not yet, but the sentence nestled somewhere behind his ribs like a seed. Behind them, an old man muttered, "We broke our backs here once. For them. Now they bleed for us. Maybe that's fair." Another shook his head. "No, it's not about revenge. It's about memory, and memory has a rhythm." One of the women whispered a prayer under her breath. Not for the prisoners, but for the mine and for the land itself, that it might learn to forgive. A girl named Aicha, holding her notebook tight, sketched the scene below. The curve of a spine under weight, the angle of a shovel against rock, the way dust caught sunlight like smoke. She didn't know yet that the sketch would one day hang in a school that hadn't been built, funded by gold that hadn't yet been mined, by hands that once came to steal it. Down below, Victor glanced up, just for a second. He saw the silhouettes on the deck. He couldn't hear their voices, but he felt their presence. Foreign, heavy, uncomfortable. The observer becomes the judged. The watch becomes aware. He looked away, ashamed not of the sentence, but of how just it suddenly felt. Up on the platform, the teacher turned to address the group. "These men," she said, "did not come with guns. They came with papers and promises. They wore suits. They smiled. And still they came to take." The children listened, some confused, some curious. She continued, voice steady. "Now they work in the same dust we once died in. Not because we hate them, but because we cannot heal unless the wound is opened." A small bell rang in the mine. Break time. The men collapsed against the walls, gasping, dripping. No one clapped. No one mocked them. The teacher gathered her class. "Let's go. You've seen enough for today." As they turned to leave, Amadou looked back one more time. The image of those men, broken yet moving, stayed with him longer than he would have guessed. Not because of their suffering, but because somehow it didn't feel like cruelty. It felt like history remembering itself. By mid-afternoon, the heat inside the mine was no longer just physical. It became a kind of presence, thick and pressing, settling on every breath like a hand squeezing slowly. The air, already thin, carried the scent of rust, damp stone, and something sour, exhaustion. It was the 5th hour of the shift. The men were starting to bend, not just their backs, but something deeper. Victor had stopped counting his swings long ago. His rhythm, once steady if not strong, had become erratic. Each strike landed farther from the last, his aim drifting, his grip loosening. He blinked sweat from his eyes, but it returned faster than he could wipe it. His glasses had broken days ago, and now the world existed in a blur of light and shadow. Outlines of guards above, walls breathing around him, his own body shrinking under invisible weight. He staggered once, caught himself. No one noticed. Or rather, no one responded. Then with one final swing that barely chipped the stone, Victor crumpled. His knees hit the ground first, then his elbow, then his face, though he turned just in time to spare his teeth. The pickaxe clanged against the wall, slid down to the dirt, and lay still. The mine didn't stop for him. Pickaxes continued to ring in rhythm. Luca glanced sideways but kept swinging, jaw clenched. Pavle didn't even look up. Everyone had learned the same lesson quickly. Attention was a currency best saved. Pain was expected. Collapse was a choice. Marcel stood a few meters away, leaning against the railing of the secondary shaft, rifle hanging loosely from his shoulder. He watched Victor fall and made no move. His eyes followed the slow, twitching movements of the collapsed man, as if he were watching a beetle turn over on its back. His expression never changed. One of the younger guards shifted uncertainly nearby. He looked at Marcel, then at Victor, then back. "Should we?" he asked, but his voice trailed off under Marcel's silence. Marcel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness was its own answer. Another guard, older, stepped forward after a long pause. Without a word, he crouched beside Victor, checked his pulse, then gently hauled him to a sitting position. He offered a sip of water. Victor blinked but didn't drink. His body slumped like something unraveling, loose and unformed. The guard stayed a moment longer, then rose and left him propped against the wall. Above, the scribes noted the event. Subject B. Victor. Collapse at 5:47 minutes, recovered. Resume pending. No medical intervention required. Marcel finally turned his head away, as if the scene had ended. Voiceover, quiet and steady. Pain was not punishment. It was the echo of choices. In this place, cruelty did not wear a mask. It wore history. It wore silence. And the men who had once orchestrated distance now lived inside the weight of it. Victor remained against the wall for the rest of the shift. He didn't ask to stop. He didn't ask for help. When the final bell rang, he stood on trembling legs, picked up his tool, and walked back into the shadows like a man whose body had remembered something his mind had long forgotten. Marcel didn't watch him leave, but deep beneath his stillness, something shifted, so small it had no name. At night, when the mine fell quiet and the guards' boots stopped echoing down the shafts, Marius worked. While others lay motionless on their cots, too exhausted to speak, too resigned to hope, he stayed awake, listening for gaps between patrols. He had memorized the rhythm of footsteps, the coughs, the faint buzz of the overhead bulbs beginning to flicker as the generators wound down. Every detail mattered. Timing, above all, would be everything. Marius wasn't part of the original 6. He'd come weeks later, transferred in from another holding site. Nobody knew his full story, only that he had served with the Foreign Legion before retiring into mercenary work. He didn't talk much, but his eyes never stopped scanning. His fingers moved constantly, scratching, marking, calculating. And for 10 nights, those fingers had dug. His tool wasn't a pickaxe, just a broken piece of rebar smuggled from the tool pile and hidden under loose boards. Each night, when the others drifted into their shallow, dreamless sleep, he would slide aside a stack of crates near the storage alcove and crawl behind them into a patch of wall that had long ago been marked abandoned on the ledger. The stone was softer there, and it whispered possibilities. He wasn't trying to save anyone else, not Victor, not Luca, not even himself in a grand moral sense. He simply refused to die in a hole dug by someone else's ambition. On the 11th night, the sound changed. The scrape of metal against stone gave way to a hollow thunk. Marius froze, heart hammering. He tapped again. Another clink, more resonant. Not rock, not pipe. Something buried. Carefully, he dug with his hands, pulling aside chunks of compacted earth until his fingers struck cold steel. A box, long, flat, and rusted at the hinges. It was wedged tightly between two rock faces, almost intentionally sealed in. He worked it loose with careful pressure until it shifted with a reluctant groan. The sound echoed through the shaft like the groan of a buried god. He listened. No footsteps. No voices. Just the beat of his own blood pounding in his ears. The lid gave way with a snap. Inside, papers, dozens of them, yellowed, brittle-edged, tightly packed and bound with faded twine. His first instinct was disappointment. This wasn't a way out. It was a dead end made of ink. But then he looked closer. Maps, contracts, purchase orders, names, coordinates. Dates stretching from 1954 to 2008. Military authorizations with French tricolor seals. Company logos that no longer existed or had been absorbed under new banners. He flipped through pages and found detailed extraction reports from mines across Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Mali. Some were marked with red wax, others stamped confidentiel, Ministère des Armées. This wasn't just data. It was a ledger of plunder. It was the anatomy of theft, preserved in bureaucratic flesh. Marius sat back on his heels, the crate open before him like a coffin of secrets. For a long time, he didn't move. The tunnel behind him was still narrow, unfinished. The air was close, heavy with the scent of rust and old paper. He hadn't found freedom. He'd found proof, and somehow it felt heavier than stone. He pulled one of the maps from the crate, folded it carefully, and slid it inside his jumpsuit. He knew someone who might understand it. Aminata, the former mining accountant they said now worked in the records division. If he could reach her, maybe the tunnel didn't need to lead out. Maybe it needed to lead deeper. Above him, the mine slept, but beneath it, something had awakened. Aminata arrived just after dusk, when the sun had dropped low enough to paint the ridges in bruised orange, and shadows spilled into the open shaft like ink. She moved through the security gate with a quiet nod to the guards, her ID lanyard tucked into the breast pocket of her tan field jacket. Nothing about her seemed rushed, but everything was deliberate. The other clerks called her Madame Comfortable behind her back, though no one dared to say it to her face. Years ago, she'd managed entire export accounts for the National Mining Bureau, until she walked out the day after Traoré's second speech and never came back. She'd said, "What's the point of tracking stolen wealth if no one listens?" and left the keys on her desk. Now she was back, but not to watch. She came to translate the earth. Inside the converted storeroom, Marius waited, sitting on an overturned bucket, the metal crate open between them. He didn't speak as she unpacked the documents with careful, gloved hands. Her eyes scanned line after line, and her breath began to shorten, not from confusion, but recognition. "These stamps," she murmured, pointing to a crest half faded under mildew, "are from the French Army's Colonial Logistics Office. This one," she flipped a page, "this is a private company shell registered in Marseille, closed in 1983, then reopened under a different name. They moved the gold, but also the land titles." Marius raised an eyebrow. "They own the land?" "No," she said flatly. "They stole the right to say who did." She reached for a folded map, brittle at the creases, and spread it across a table that once held mining helmets. A spiderweb of red dots spanned from Guinea to Ghana, crossing borders like smudges on a page. Each dot was marked with two dates, discovery and abandonment. But Aminata traced her finger along a third, hidden layer, handwritten in fine graphite. 23, she whispered. Hidden sites. Gold shafts sealed before independence. No taxes, no records, no compensation. Marius leaned in. "And no one knows?" Aminata looked up, her eyes not angry, but burning with something older. "They didn't just take the gold. They buried our right to know it." The words landed like stone dropped into still water. Marius leaned back, staring at the map. Each dot was more than a location. It was a scar, a silenced village, a contract no one remembered signing. She lifted another file, thinner, newer. This one's dated 2005. It references military protection for private contractors, mentions names that appeared on your intake forms. She looked him in the eye. Some of the men down there, they weren't just soldiers. They were couriers of silence. Marius felt the walls shift around him, not physically but morally. The tunnel he had carved to escape now felt more like a bridge. He thought he'd hit a wall. Instead, he'd opened a grave. Imanata carefully refolded the map and placed it back in the crate. "I'm taking this to the commission," she said, "but not yet. If we go public too soon, they'll panic. Burn the rest. Discredit us. We wait, we gather more." He nodded. For the first time since his arrival, his breath came easier. Not because he was safe, but because now someone knew. Aminata glanced toward the shaft. Below, the men worked in silence, pickaxes rising and falling like heartbeats in the dark. "You thought you were digging for freedom," she said gently. "Turns out, you were just clearing the dust off a memory." She picked up the crate and left without another word. And Marius sat alone, hands resting on his knees, staring at the empty space where secrets used to sleep. It began without warning. Just after the 8 p.m. news, the screen flickered. The usual announcer was absent. No music, no preamble. Just a slow fade into a single image, a black file folder stamped with the faded insignia of the French Ministry of Defense, its title redacted in thick marker. The voice that followed was calm, measured, without ceremony, almost clinical. "These are official documents," it said, "recovered from beneath the old Kamana shaft. Their contents speak for themselves." What followed was 40 uninterrupted minutes of revelation. One by one, scanned pages filled the screen. Contracts with unnamed beneficiaries, satellite maps marked with blood-red zones, lists of extraction yields, payouts to dummy corporations, and handwritten memos requesting non-disclosure coordination with colonial officers on site. Names flashed and vanished under black bars, but the dates remained untouched. 1954, 1963, 1977, 2001. Entire decades of silence crumbled before a nation watching with mouths half open. In living rooms and village halls, in outdoor cafes with rusted TVs balanced on crates, people leaned forward, barely breathing. Children watched their parents grow quiet. Old transistor radios began to relay the same broadcast across regions that had no reliable electricity. Even in the capital, where apathy had become routine, the streets grew hushed. In a dusty home in Kudugu, an old woman named Nia wept without sound. She had been a young girl when her father vanished after refusing to sell ancestral land to a French surveyor. She had been told for years he'd left willingly. The file showed otherwise. In Bobo Dioulasso, a retired teacher stood slowly from his chair, pointing at the screen with a trembling hand. "That's my signature," he whispered. "I signed that paper thinking it was for school funding. They turned it into a mining right." And in Ouagadougou, in a rooftop bar filled with students and activists, someone captured a photo of the screen mid-broadcast. They posted it with a caption that, within hours, would echo across the continent. "They stole the gold, but not the fire." The tweet caught flame in seconds. By morning, it had been translated into 5 languages, painted on walls, printed on t-shirts, and quoted by street performers reciting poetry to bus stops. At the heart of it all was not just outrage, but confirmation. Not just discovery, but recognition. Elders across the countryside whispered, "We always knew." Not in arrogance, but in grief. They had felt it, in the way rivers dried too fast, in how their sons left to work on land they no longer owned, in the way the soil seemed angry without explanation. They had always known something had been taken. Now they finally saw its weight on paper. Back in the state newsroom, the director stood behind the control panel, arms folded. He had been warned not to air the files, had been told to wait. But Aminata had come in with her crate and one quiet sentence. "If we don't tell it, someone else will. On their terms, not ours." The broadcast ended not with commentary or applause, but with silence. The final frame, a map of West Africa, overlaid with 23 red dots. No names, no legend, just dots and dates. Across the country, phones buzzed. Radios replayed the lines. And somewhere deep below, in the mine still echoing with labor, 6 men swung their tools without knowing the world above had shifted. Truth had surfaced, not from courts, not from protests, but from a hole in the earth once meant to bury it forever. Now the question hung in the air like static. What do you do when the truth finally shows its face? The rain didn't come gently. It came as if the sky had been holding its breath for 100 years and finally exhaled with fury. Thick sheets of water slammed into the hills, pounding the red earth until it flowed like blood through every crack and crevice. The mine, carved deep into the bones of the land, had been dormant for decades before Traoré's order reawakened it. But its drainage systems were old, rusted, and forgotten, like so many things left behind by the ones who came to take. Within 30 minutes of the downpour, water had begun to pool at the main shaft's entrance. Within an hour, it was flowing down the tunnels like a river seeking its lost mouth. Jean Ouedraogo was soaked to the skin when he reached the lower platform. His boots sloshed. His voice rang sharp through the chaos. "Evacuate. Section A and C first. Anyone deeper. Get ropes, masks, light." The floodlights flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Mud streaked every surface. Guards moved with urgency, guiding exhausted prisoners toward the lifts. Some stumbled in confusion. Others resisted, still clutching tools, still swinging at rock, as if refusing to surrender to anything but the shift bell. Jean grabbed one by the collar, shaking him. "You'll drown in here." But not everyone moved. Victor sat slumped against a wall, refusing help. His lips were pale, but his eyes steady. "If this is where it ends, so be it," he muttered. "I earned it." Jean cursed and waved another guard over. "Drag him if you have to." A sudden shout broke the noise. "Where's Pavle?" Luca cried, spinning around. "He was in the tunnel. We were mapping the vein." No one had seen him in over 20 minutes. Then from the shadows beyond the flickering light, a figure emerged. Not toward the exit, but toward the depths. Pavle stood shirtless, rope wrapped tightly around his chest and shoulder, like a climbing harness. His face was streaked with mud. He held a flashlight between his teeth. "I marked the collapse point 3 days ago," he said, voice tight. "If we don't clear it, this whole section floods. We'll lose everything. The docks, the evidence." Jean stared at him. "This isn't your fight." Pavle shrugged. "It is now." Before anyone could stop him, he turned and vanished into the rising water, his headlamp blinking once before the darkness swallowed it. The storm roared louder. Above ground, the command tent was already half flooded. Marcel stood on higher ground, radio pressed to his ear. "No signal from Sector D," he said. "We're blind down there." Aminata, just arriving with additional crates for transfer, stepped forward, drenched and shaking. "If those records are down there, we can't let them drown. That's not just paper, that's memory. That's leverage." Jean stood still, face streaked with rain and dirt, caught between orders and instinct. Then he turned to the winch operator. "Prep the secondary pulley. He'll need a line back." No one said it aloud, but the truth was clear. Pavle had gone in with no guarantee of return, not for escape, not for glory, but to save the only thing in that mine heavier than gold, the truth. As the water rose, silence spread. Every boot stomp, every shouted command, every breath became sharper, more fragile. Somewhere below, rope slid against wet stone. A light blinked once in the dark, and the earth, long used to swallowing secrets, now faced a man determined to pull one back out. Pavle's fingers were raw by the time he reached the choke point. The water was chest deep and rising fast, brown with mud and cold enough to make his bones ache. Every breath he took tasted of rust and panic. The rope strapped to his torso pulled tight with each step as the current fought to drag him backward. His flashlight flickered again, casting sharp shadows on the stone. Somewhere ahead he could hear the rush, an unnatural roar. The main drainage shaft was blocked. If it didn't clear soon, the entire lower tunnel system would drown. He reached the opening just as the water surged waist-high. A mass of broken crates, loose gravel, and a twisted metal grate had jammed the flow. Pavle wedged his body against the wall, bracing with one knee while pulling at the debris. A crate gave way, sending a violent swirl of water against his chest, nearly knocking him over. He gasped, spat out mud, and kept pulling. His muscles screamed. His hands bled. Still, he worked. Then something snapped. A support beam cracked above him, and a chunk of stone plunged into the water, missing him by inches. For a moment, everything went black. He ducked, nearly slipping. His flashlight disappeared into the flood. He was now working blind. His hand closed on the edge of the metal grate. One final wrench. It tore free, and with it, the water exploded forward, shooting through the shaft like a cannon. The pressure dropped instantly, pulling at his legs. Pavle gripped the rope and screamed, but the sound drowned beneath the current. He was yanked sideways, slammed against the wall, and nearly swallowed. Above, John and 2 guards hauled on the rope. His boots skidded in the mud, his body limp, unconscious when they dragged him out. They thought that was the end of the storm. But the mine wasn't finished. A tremor shivered through the lower corridor, a sound like splitting wood, then the unmistakable crack of stone collapsing. In a far tunnel, Marcel was on patrol, inspecting the perimeter, when the ceiling gave way. Debris rained down in thick, choking clouds. He shouted and tried to run, but a beam dropped across his legs, pinning him in the mud. For a long minute, no one came. Then through the swirling dust, a figure emerged. A prisoner. Not one of the original 6, but another. Lean, dark-skinned, face smeared with sweat and soot. His name was Kofi. He had never spoken to Marcel, never been noticed. But now he was there, crawling through the wreckage, hands already on the beam. Marcel choked. "What? What are you doing?" Kofi didn't answer. He braced his shoulder against the stone and heaved. The beam shifted, then dropped again. "You'll break your back," Marcel hissed, groaning in pain. "Then we'll both be broken," Kofi said. "But we won't be buried." With one last push, the beam rolled aside. Marcel gasped, dragging himself free. Kofi grabbed him under the arms and hauled him clear, coughing, shaking. Marcel stared at him, disoriented. "Why help me?" he asked, voice low, cracked. Kofi didn't smile. He just looked him in the eye and said, "Because I finally saw who the enemy was, and it wasn't you." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something unspoken, recognition perhaps, or the quiet understanding that survival sometimes required more than justice. It required mercy. Above, the sky began to clear. Rain slowed to a whisper, and below, in the hollowed veins of the earth, two men, one guard, one prisoner, sat side by side in the mud, breathing the same air, for the first time not as symbols, but as survivors. When Pavle opened his eyes, everything was white. Not the blinding white of death, though for a moment he wasn't sure. It was fabric, canvas stretched tight above his head, rippling gently in the breeze. The kind of makeshift field tent used for emergencies and war zones. The air smelled of iodine, wet boots, and iron. He blinked again, and pain answered from every limb. His ribs throbbed, his wrist burned, and his right shoulder felt like it had been crushed by a mountain. But he was alive. Voices murmured around him, clipped and hushed. Medical staff moved quickly, efficiently. Across the tent, a nurse stitched a cut above someone's brow. A young soldier stood nearby, arms behind his back, silent but watching. As Pavle was lifted onto a stretcher to be moved, the soldier stepped forward. He wore the maroon beret of the Presidential Guard, barely in his 20s, clean uniform, clean boots. But it was his eyes that caught attention, clear, unblinking, focused. He didn't speak. He just stood at the foot of the stretcher and raised his hand to his temple. A salute, sharp, precise, held longer than necessary. Pavle stared back, confused at first. Then something shifted in his chest. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. The soldier dropped the salute and stepped back into formation. No one said a word. Later that afternoon, the wind changed and the tent flaps parted. The guards outside straightened. Traoré entered without announcement, boots damp from the rain, uniform jacket rolled at the sleeves. He moved without entourage, only a small leather notebook in his hand. Pavle, still strapped to his stretcher, managed to sit up slightly with effort. Traoré stopped at his bedside, looked him over, then spoke simply. "You could have run." Pavle exhaled through his nose. "I thought about it." "And?" He stared at the canvas ceiling for a moment, then turned his eyes back to the president. "Then I'd still be who I was. Sureke Nako." That landed heavier than anything else in the room. Traoré studied him a second longer, then gave a single nod, more acknowledgement than approval. "You saved the mine, and the records." Pavle smirked, winced. "Didn't mean to be heroic, just didn't want to drown in someone else's lie." Traoré allowed the faintest hint of a smile before turning to leave. "Rest. You'll be needed again soon, not for punishment, for purpose." As he stepped out into the light, something had already shifted outside. The yard near the shaft, once clearly divided between uniforms and jumpsuits, was now a blur of orange and olive. Guards and prisoners worked together, side by side, clearing debris, repairing support beams, and bailing out water by the bucket load. No one gave orders. The urgency had leveled everyone to the same rhythm. Marcel limped past a wheelbarrow and past Kofi a water canteen without a word. Kofi took it, drank, and passed it along. At the mine's edge, Luca sat beside Victor, who now walked with a cane fashioned from scrap. They weren't speaking, but their silence had softened. It no longer carried accusation, just a quiet kind of knowing. Above them all, Aminata stood with Jean, watching the sight return to motion. She whispered, "So many years trying to force truth into daylight, and it was a flood that finally did it." Jean didn't respond. He just kept watching. And in the medical tent, Pavle closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion, but peace. Not because he had been forgiven, but because maybe he had finally begun to change what he would be remembered for. Not what he destroyed, but what he chose to save. The forge was built in silence. No ceremony, no declaration. Just 3 men, 1 guard, 1 prisoner, 1 village metalsmith, bending over scrap iron and rusted steel under the rising sun. It had been Jean's idea, though he never took credit. After the flood, after the papers were saved, after the lines between uniforms and jumpsuits began to blur into something else, he'd walked to the edge of the mine and stood staring at a pile of old shackles. They were from a forgotten storeroom, tangled like vines, some from old colonial shipments, others repurposed by later regimes. They hadn't been used here, not in Traoré's system, but they'd been kept all the same. For security, someone had once said. Jean had ordered them melted, so the forge rose stone by stone, built from the broken bricks of the old watchtower, and for 3 nights the fire inside burned without pause, fed by diesel and breath, sweat and memory. The shackles hissed as they surrendered. Metal turned molten, boundaries turned fluid. Pavle, still recovering but insistent, worked the bellows. His shoulder ached, but he pushed through. Luca kept notes, scribbling diagrams on the backs of ration slips. Kofi fetched water, brought wood, learned quickly. Even Victor helped where he could, cutting molds from old crates, adjusting angles, doing the math. They didn't speak much during the work. The fire didn't allow it, but there was something in their movements, synchronized, equal, that said more than talk ever could. On the 4th day, as the last of the alloy was stirred into the crucible, the village smith, a man named Ibrahima, stepped forward with a small clay mold, handcrafted, simple, shaped like an upside-down flame. Etched into its side, just beneath the lip, was an inscription in 3 languages, "To the children of Burkina." He didn't explain it. No one asked. Everyone understood. The pouring began just before dawn. The mold swallowed the fire, drank the heat. Then they waited. By sunset, the bell was ready. They cracked the mold open like an egg. What emerged wasn't perfect. The shape slightly uneven, the surface rippled like water. But it held. Solid. Heavy. Bronze born from iron once meant to bind. It glowed in the fading light, humming with warmth. Jean held it in both hands, surprised by how small it was. Not a church bell, not a war bell. Just a palm-sized chime, maybe 20 centimeters tall. But its weight was real. At the shift change, just before the night crew descended, the workers, prisoners, guards, miners, even scribes gathered near the mouth of the shaft. No orders had been given. Word had simply spread. Something was about to happen. Traoré arrived last, walking alone. Jean stepped forward, bell in hand. No speech, no banner. He turned to the president, offered it without flourish. Traoré took it. He held the bell up, looked at the inscription, then at the people around him, and rang it, just once. The sound was clear, not loud, not sharp, but deep, rounded, resonant. It cut through the camp like a ripple through still water. Hammers paused midair. Conversations fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that single tone was everything that had been done and undone. Every chain broken, every truth recovered, every face once hidden now seen. No applause followed, no chants, just silence. But it was a good silence, an honored silence, the kind that comes after a wound stops bleeding. Pavle exhaled. Luca closed his notebook. Kofi lowered his head. Aminata, standing just outside the circle, felt her hands tremble. She whispered almost to herself, "Let them forget our names, but never this sound." Traoré placed the bell on a stone pedestal at the mine's entrance. No guard would be posted, no plaque added. It would ring once a week, on Sunday mornings, when no one worked and everyone remembered. Not out of guilt, out of promise. A new beginning, cast from the ruins of old endings. And so, under a sky clearing from storm, a bell was born. The sun had just begun to rise when Aicha arrived at the mine. She wore her school uniform, a faded blue dress with the hem just slightly frayed, and carried nothing but a tiny Burkinabe flag, its colors still bright despite the wear on the fabric. Her braids were freshly tied with red ribbons. There was no adult with her, no official escort, just a child with a quiet mission, walking barefoot down the path carved by machines and memory. The camp had changed by then. Guards no longer stood with rifles at the ready. Prisoners no longer walked in single file. The labor continued, but it had transformed. Reconstruction had replaced punishment, and the sounds rising from the mine were those of rebuilding, not revenge. Aisha stopped just outside the main shaft. Her shoes had been taken off at the road, out of respect. Her feet pressed softly into the warm dirt as she scanned the area. To her left, a stack of crates filled with salvaged documents. To her right, the stone pedestal where the bell rested, its bronze surface catching the early light like fire sealed in metal. She walked to the edge of the shaft entrance, where the concrete met earth, and knelt. She held the flag in both hands, then gently pushed its thin wooden stem into the ground. It wobbled at first, then stood firm, anchored in the same soil once soaked with labor, gold, and silence. Aisha leaned close to it and whispered, "For my mother, who sold bread here. For all the mornings she left before I woke up. For all the days she came home empty." Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and stepped back. Two prisoners nearby had watched the whole thing in silence. One was Luca, now on light duty, still wearing the orange jumpsuit but with a pen in his breast pocket instead of a tool. The other was Kofi, who had long since stopped counting his days. Neither of them moved at first. Then Kofi crouched beside the flag, careful not to touch it, and whispered, "That's where the gold is." Luca chuckled softly. "No, that's where it begins." A camp medic, watching from afar, raised her phone and snapped a picture. Aisha, standing upright beside the little flag, Kofi kneeling, Luca behind them, hand resting lightly on his knee. A triangle of stillness framed by a mind full of motion. The photo went viral within hours. Caption: "She planted more than a flag." It appeared on protest signs, university walls, WhatsApp chains, and public billboards. It was printed in black and white on school posters with the words "La vérité ne s'enterre pas." The truth doesn't stay buried. Some tried to politicize it, others tried to erase it, but the image had already taken root in the minds of those who saw it. Not because of the men, not even because of the mine, but because of her, Aisha, a child who had no stake in the war of governments and soldiers, but who understood something bigger than all of them. That remembering was its own form of resistance. That week, a small plaque was added beside the bell, written in 3 languages, including Moray. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just finally spoken. And still, every Sunday morning, the bell rang once. But now, after the chime faded, people would gather at the little flag in the dirt. They'd leave flowers, notes, photos, sometimes just their presence. The mine was still deep, the history darker still. But for the first time in a long time, something had risen from it. Not gold, not guilt, but a girl with a flag, and she had left it for all of them. The first school opened 6 months after the bell rang. It stood on the hill just beyond the mine's eastern edge, where the soil had once been stripped bare by machines searching for veins of gold. Now the ground bloomed green again, young trees taking root where nothing had dared grow before. The building itself was modest, 3 classrooms made of brick and recycled tin, a painted mural stretching across its outer wall, showing children holding books, standing on foundations made of stone and names. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no foreign donors. The labor had come from the same hands that once swung pickaxes underground. The former prisoners were the first to lift the shovels. Pavle had left for recovery abroad, but his blueprints, hand-drawn while in the medical tent, guided the layout. Thomas, once silent and heavy-shouldered, was now the lead on the gardening team. Each morning before sunrise, he walked the school perimeter, planting fruit trees and herbs, his palms in the earth, whispering to the soil like it was a long-lost brother. Luca, meanwhile, did something no one expected. He stayed. The jumpsuit was gone. In its place, a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled, chalk dust on his hands. He volunteered to teach math 3 days a week. At first, the children stared. Some parents were wary, but over time, numbers softened their suspicion. He didn't teach like a professor. He taught like someone making up for lost time. Fractions became puzzles, geometry a story of shapes and spaces that finally made sense. One afternoon, while showing a boy how to divide a rectangle into eighths, he said, half joking, "This is the kind of work I should have been doing all along." The boy looked up and replied, "So why didn't you?" Luca paused, then smiled. "Because I didn't know what it looked like until now." Outside, Thomas worked the garden with a few teenagers, digging beds, turning compost, laughing in short bursts. One of them had been born the year the documents were sealed underground. Now he was planting tomatoes above them. Jean Ouedraogo came often but didn't interfere. He stood quietly at the edge of the schoolyard, hands behind his back, watching as children poured through the gates each morning, some barefoot, some in borrowed uniforms, all with eyes open wide. He said little to the press. When they came to ask why a school had been built next to a mine that once symbolized punishment, he gave only one sentence: "Let the bell ring, not to warn, but to remind." And every Sunday when the bronze bell sang its single note, the classrooms fell silent. Children paused mid-lesson, teachers stood still. Even the birds seemed to hush, not from fear, but from memory. The school's name was carved above the front door in smooth stone: École de la Vérité, the School of Truth. There were no golden plaques, no statues, just the echo of choices and the murmur of pages turning where once only pickaxes struck. And in the garden, where gold once fell and silence once ruled, life began to grow again, bright, curious, and loud. Aminata found the map folded between two brittle sheets of trade records, both stamped 1961. She almost missed it. The paper was hand-drawn, the ink faded to a soft rust color, the edges torn from decades of neglect. But the details were unmistakable. Coastlines, mountain ranges, and faint dotted lines crisscrossing West Africa like veins under fragile skin. What set this map apart wasn't geography. It was what had been deliberately left out and what had been added by hand. There were no national borders. Instead, the land had been divided into zones labeled in French. Zone d'extraction A, réserve stratégique, territoire privé. Mines, rivers, and transport routes were all meticulously charted, but none of them appeared on any official maps of the time. Along the bottom, scrawled in looping cursive, was a single phrase: "Pour les yeux de l'Empire uniquement," for the Empire's eyes only. Aminata stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the path of a faded railway line that ran straight through her hometown, one she had never known existed. She brought the map to Traoré without a word, just unrolled it across his desk and let the silence speak. He looked down, jaw tightening. Then, without looking up, he said, "We're taking this to Addis." The African Union Summit was held that year in Addis Ababa, in the same hall that had once echoed the voices of liberation leaders long gone. This time the room was heavy not with ideology, but with weary pragmatism. The world outside was on fire. Conflicts, debt crises, climate collapse. Unity felt like a slogan more than a goal. Until Traoré stepped to the podium. He wore no medals, no epaulets, no political banners, just a plain charcoal suit and the old map, carefully mounted on a wide easel beside him. He didn't speak immediately, just pointed at the map. "This," he said, voice calm but firm, "was drawn before we were born, before we were independent, before we even knew what had been taken." Delegates shifted in their seats. Cameras clicked. The silence deepened. "It shows 23 mines, 9 rail routes, 14 covert stations. Not a single one recorded in our own archives. Not a single one taxed, shared, or disclosed. This is not a map of wealth. This is a blueprint of theft." He let that hang in the air, then leaned forward. "We are not poor. We were made invisible." Murmurs rose. Some clapped. Others simply nodded, eyes locked on the ink-stained paper behind him. "For decades we begged for aid, for relief, for forgiveness of debts created in the shadows of maps like these. No more. We don't want apologies. We want clarity. We want every government, every company, every archive that holds knowledge of what was extracted from our soil to return that truth to us." He paused, then added, "That will be the real decolonization." The room, once still, erupted into discussion. Some cheered, some whispered, But the energy had shifted. The summit's agenda, previously filled with the usual half steps and diplomacy, was rewritten overnight. Outside on the plaza steps, activists and students from across the continent gathered around a projected image of the map, studying it like scripture. One young woman from Senegal murmured, "It's not just a document, it's proof that we were right to remember." In Burkina Faso, Aminata watched the live stream from her office above the mine. She saw Traoré's face, heard the words, and felt a strange, quiet swell inside her. It wasn't pride exactly. It was justice, spoken aloud, in the full light of day, and it had started from a torn piece of paper buried in the earth. 3 days after Traoré's speech in Addis Ababa, the first tremor struck, not from beneath the earth, but from deep within the halls of neighboring governments. In Ghana, the Ministry of Natural Resources ordered an emergency audit of all colonial-era mining concessions. A press conference followed within 24 hours, where a junior minister stood stiffly beside a wall of sealed archive boxes. "We must know," he said, "not only what was taken, but what was hidden from us." That night, state television played footage of hand-drawn maps, eerily similar to the one Traoré had unveiled, bearing British surveyor stamps and coordinates for mines now listed as inactive. Mali moved next. The Prime Minister issued a statement declaring all foreign-held mining contracts older than 1990, subject to public inquiry. A task force was formed. Lawyers scrambled. Civil society groups, long ignored, were invited to speak directly in Parliament. In Côte d'Ivoire, it wasn't the government that moved first, it was the people. University students stormed the gates of a regional mining office in Abidjan, demanding the release of dormant permits. One protester held up a cardboard sign reading, "We don't want aid, we want accounting." Online, the movement spread like fire on dry season grass. The hashtags trended first in West Africa, then across the globe. Hashtag "We were never poor," hashtag "Digging Truth," hashtag "Return." The map's diaspora communities added their voices. In Brussels, a sit-in blocked the entrance to a multinational mining firm headquartered in a mirrored tower. In London, African-born youth marched down Whitehall, wrapped in Ghanaian, Malian, and Burkinabe flags, chanting in unison, "Truth is ours, give it back." But it was Paris that saw the sharpest edges of the reckoning. On the steps of the Assemblée Nationale, a silent protest formed, rows of young Africans and Afro-descendants sitting barefoot, holding photocopies of the 1954 mining map discovered by Aminata. No chants, no slogans, just presence, just paper. It was impossible to ignore. French media tried to spin, officials deflected. But the image of one child holding a placard, "They took gold, we kept memory," ran on the front page of Le Monde the next morning. In Burkina Faso, the streets remained calm, but the air had changed. Markets buzzed louder, schools assigned essays on extractive colonialism, and near the old mine, where the bronze bell still rang every Sunday, the crowd began to grow. Not just miners, not just former prisoners, but children, teachers, mothers. They didn't come for spectacle. They came because, for the first time, they believed their voices might echo beyond the hills. Aminata stood outside her office one afternoon, phone in hand, watching the real-time surge of tweets, clips, and translated speeches. She turned to Jean beside her and said quietly, "This isn't just a moment anymore." Jean nodded. "No, it's a shift. A tectonic one, not beneath the ground, but in the story Africa told of itself and refused to let anyone else write again. For weeks, Europe had watched in uneasy quiet. African nations were auditing, rising, remembering. Protests bloomed like wildfire across diaspora streets. And still, in the marble offices of Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, most governments held their breath, hoping the storm would pass without forcing acknowledgement. Then the leak came. It started as a quiet post on a whistleblower forum, an anonymous drop of internal memos and emails spanning nearly 2 decades. Within hours, journalists from Der Spiegel, Le Monde, and The Guardian were cross-referencing dates, names, map coordinates. One thread stood out, a 2006 email from a French energy executive to a senior defense attaché. The Comana file must stay buried. If surfaced, it opens doors to uncomfortable compensations. Another from 1998 referenced preemptive influence management in former territories, code for pressuring African governments to keep old contracts sealed. Attached, scanned pages of the same colonial-era map now making headlines in Accra and Ouagadougou. By the next morning, headlines changed. Was colonial looting systematic? Unearthing what we were paid to ignore. Leaked emails reveal complicity in resource silence. Editorials began to appear, first with caution, then confession. The most honest came from Le Monde. Its front page didn't feature a photo, only bold black text on white. It's not that we didn't know, it's that we didn't want to. In TV panels and university halls, debates flared. Protesters appeared outside corporate headquarters not just in solidarity, but in shame. French students marched alongside diaspora youth, chanting not Vive la France, but Dites la vérité. Tell the truth. One professor at the Sorbonne delivered a now viral lecture. This was not the absence of knowledge. It was the management of amnesia. In Britain, a former colonial affairs minister was pressed on live television. When asked if reparations would be considered, he hesitated, then muttered, "I think we owe the conversation, at least." Back in Burkina Faso, Aminata read the quotes aloud to her class. The students didn't cheer. They just listened. Then one girl in the back said softly, "They didn't break the silence. The silence cracked by itself. And once it cracked, it could no longer hold." The final gold bar was cast quietly without ceremony. It rested still warm on a wooden block at the mine's edge, small, heavy, and unremarkable next to the weight of what had passed. Traoré stood watching. No speech, no applause, just a nod to Jean. "Seal it," he said. By sundown, the main shaft was closed. Welded steel, poured concrete, and a final ring of the bell marked its end. The mine that once held secrets now held memory, and it would hold no more. The bell, once perched at the mouth of the shaft, was moved. Its new home stood at the entrance of the school. It sat on a stone column beneath the words, "Learn what was hidden, teach what was earned." One by one, the remaining prisoners were given two paths, repatriation or integration. Most chose to stay, not out of duty, but out of choice. They had built something here. Many had become teachers, builders, gardeners. Their debt had become direction. Marcel walked toward Pavle just before dusk. No one stood nearby. They faced each other in silence. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a wall that no longer existed. Marcel extended a hand. Pavle took it. No words passed between them. None were needed. The bell rang once more that evening, not to begin work, but to say it was finished. Years passed. The mine became a garden. The path where trucks once rumbled now curved between rows of mango trees and hibiscus. Wildflowers had claimed the edges of the old rail tracks. Children walked barefoot across grassy hills that once held bunkers and burden. Where noise had ruled, birds sang. Jean returned one Sunday, older now, his hair silvered, cane in hand. His two grandchildren ran ahead, laughing, their voices echoing in the warm air. He followed slowly, eyes scanning the land he once guarded. They stopped before a bronze plaque beneath a wide neem tree. The children read aloud. "They dug for profit, we rose for peace." "Who's we?" one asked. Jean smiled softly. Anyone who chose to build when others tried to bury. Nearby, a community center bustled with music, lessons, and laughter. Aminata now led workshops on historical memory. Luca taught arithmetic. Tomas harvested fruit with local students. The garden was more than green. It was proof. Proof that broken land could hold life. Proof that pain could root something better. Proof that justice didn't have to end with vengeance. It could end with vision. Jean looked to the distant bell near the school, still intact. One of his grandkids ran to it, hand hovering. "Can I ring it?" Jean nodded. The bell rang, soft, clear, and the wind carried it, not as a warning, but as a memory. Later that afternoon, as Jean sat on a bench carved from old minewood, his grandson asked him, "Was it hard to forgive them?" Jean didn't answer immediately. He watched the children chasing each other through mango shade, heard the wind dance through the branches. "Forgiveness," he said slowly. isn't always about forgetting. Sometimes it's about growing past what tried to shrink you. His granddaughter pointed to the spot where the shaft used to be. That's where the gold was? Yes, Jean said, but the real treasure is here now. She frowned. Where? He looked around. In the garden, in the school, in the choices we made. There was silence. Then his grandson asked one more question. Is that what justice means? Joan smiled. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it grows. The boy looked thoughtful, then ran to join the others under the trees. As the sun dipped lower, the bell rang once again, not loudly but clearly, not because anyone was forced to listen, but because now everyone chose to remember. This story reminds us that justice isn't always loud. It sometimes grows quietly, like roots beneath wounded soil. What began as punishment transformed into healing, and what was buried in silence rose as shared memory. It's a powerful reflection on how truth, when faced honestly, can lead not to division, but dignity. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it reshapes the future. Through pain, labor, and reckoning, a broken place became a garden. What would your community look like if it turned its scars into seeds? Would you help it grow? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.